Hi, everyone. Welcome to the podcast. I'm here with Rob Henderson, and we're going to discuss a very old movie that seems sort of random, but I think it's interesting. It's called The Blackboard Jungle. It's a 1955 American film about an inner city school, and I learned about this movie because it was in Derek Thompson's book Hitmakers, and basically it launched the basically launched rock and roll, because that's like 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock, three rock around the clock. That's what it's called. So it opens with rock around the clock. And like apparently like the year before on the Billboard charts, if you look at like the top songs, before like the mid 1950s, 1955 or 56 or so, it's all stuff that could have been written in 1850. There's a song called like Yellow Rose of Texas, which sounds like a ballad from the Civil War or something, right? So that's like 1940s, 1950s, early 1950s culture. And then like rock and roll just like takes off with Rock Around the Clock, which is still like one of the most popular songs of all time. And so this movie actually wasn't that popular. It was like the 10th most popular movie or something like that in 1955. But the song that was at the start of it like really took off. So the movie represents something historically important. But it's interesting. It has Sidney Poitier and these other important actors from the time. Um, and yeah, there's just a lot here. I can talk about what sort of struck me the most about it. Rob, what did you think about this movie?
Yeah, I mean, I generally enjoy watching old movies, just because they're a nice sort of glimpse into a sort of different time, different cultural mores, different sort of setting, and I don't know, I'm just like naturally, yeah, just fond of these sort of older movies. And when you sent me the synopsis or whatever of this movie, and yeah, you sent me the screenshots or pictures of Derek Thompson's book. I'm like, okay, this sounds interesting. Sort of the birth of rock and roll, and I wasn't sure what to expect. So it's funny, like about a year and a half ago, I had this conversation with this just randomly, this guy who reads my Substack. He graduated from the same high school I graduated from in California, and he graduated in 1955. So he's like, I think he's around, got to be close to 90 now. And I asked him, what was Red Bluff High School like in 1955? And he was like, wasn't that, it's like, kids would smoke cigarettes, and occasionally you'd see a kid with a beer or whatever. Like, it just wasn't, there wasn't anything bad going on. And I'm like, it's a sharp contrast to what the high school is like, at least when I graduated in the late 2000s. And so, I see, I read the Wikipedia page for this movie. I'm like, oh, like it builds itself as like this movie, like the shocking movie of like the horrors of the inner city and like these violent miscreants, these
Yeah.
hoodlums. And I was like, oh, this is going to be like these kids shoplift, or like it's not going to be serious. And I watched it. I'm like, oh, like this actually, it does portray it as like actually kind of a vicious place. I mean, it's kind of silly in some ways because they speak with that sort of like 1950s colloquial, the language that they use. It feels a little unserious from that sense. But then, like, yeah, the climax of the movie, the kid pulls out a knife, and the funniest scene for me, I mean, I shouldn't say it's funny, but it was a little bit ridiculous. Where like two of the students, like, essentially, I think, try to like sexually assault one of the teachers in the library, and the main character Dadier, he breaks the glass and like has to like rescue her from the library from these two guys. I'm like, yeah, this is like it's sort of campy because it's in the 1950s and the way that they shoot it, but yeah, like it was actually I could see like for that time why the critics and the viewers, like, why this might have been a shocking movie for them. So yeah,
Yeah,
it was interesting.
and it has a like a sort of a disclaimer or something, an announcement at the beginning of the movie where it's like we take juvenile delinquency very seriously, and we just have to. So you look at like data from the 1950s. I mean, things don't really get bad until the 1960s. I think there definitely probably was like something going on, but I think society. I mean, it was probably just like from the baseline, like the Great Depression, World War II America, like the 1950s probably seemed shocking. Oh, it's like, Greece, like these kids with their leather jackets and their drag racing or whatever they were into. It gets crazier in the 1960s and 1970s. But yeah, I mean, I think it was, yeah, interesting the sexual aggression Like they wouldn't show this like today. It's like today things got much worse, but like you can't show them as like rapists, like ready to rape any. They would show the woman beating up the young, the woman would beat up the 15-year-old boys or be able to defend themselves. But back then, made like you have
You
this,
couldn't show like a male teacher rescuing her from like
you could not that either, right?
troublemakers.
But she wouldn't even be in that situation. She'd slap them and and beat them,
Tell them
and,
off, cut them down somehow,
or they wouldn't even be rapists. They would just want to like rob someone because like to show that, like like if someone's like a rapist, that's like different from being a thief or a murderer, right? It's like a hero can't in a movie can't be like a rapist or a wife beater, right? Like movies, and so I think that's like it's just like so different.
Well, these aren't like those weren't like
no, they weren't hero. You're right, but it's like
these are just two students, like two vicious students.
Right.
You wouldn't see that today in like this kind of like movie, this high school setting of like troubled youth or whatever. Like you wouldn't show them like trying to sexually assault one of the teachers. That's true. I guess. Yeah. Why is that? Is that because it's too horrifying or because it's too graphic? I mean,
I think it's something.
Why wouldn't they?
I think it's something like that. I remember there was a show at Bill Maher's, he used to have a show I used to like called Politically Incorrect in the 1990s. And he was talking about there was a wrestler called the Wife Beater. And he said, why do we make such, and people were getting mad. And he's like, why do they get mad about Wife Beater? There's a wrestler called the Hitman. And nobody cares about, isn't a hitman worse than a wife beater? And it's like, it's like, I think there's this like feminist, I remember when I was in my criminal law class, we had to talk about the legal issues surrounding rape. And the professor would be very careful. Like, we have to preface this. This is very upsetting. But like, we talk about murder. We talk about people, killing each other and, stuff that should be theoretically just as traumatic. And so, I think there's something about like, it's sort of like how, like, John McWhorter says that like the old swear words aren't swear words anymore. Like racial slurs are like the new swear words because that's what's actually taboo. It's sort of like, we have this taboo about like race and sexual issues. And just like portraying rape or showing rape or something like that.
Well, is this just a post Me Too thing? Because like I'm thinking about like more recent, like okay, so The Sopranos has that famous scene with Dr. Melfi when she was assaulted, and then in Mad Men there's a scene with Joan in Dawn's office where her husband rapes her. And
you could still show rape. You could still show rape. I think kids, it's like they're kids, so like they're minors, so you shouldn't think that they're that bad that they could
that they're capable.
Rape.
And like, well, I think they were. I don't remember. I think there were two white kids, but like, I don't know. I guess there is something that feels right to me for some reason, and I'm trying to figure out why they wouldn't be able to show something like that today. It would be like because like even like Game of Thrones, right? Like, is that because it takes place in like a fantasy world, a different era? Because like I've never seen the movie or the show, but a lot of people tell me there's like
Game of Thrones was very politically incorrect in the early season because it stuck very closely to the source material, which was 1990s novels, and then it got ahead of the novels and sort of became more politically correct in later seasons. But when I was in law school,
go ahead.
Yeah, but when I was in law school, that was like 2011, 2012. So back then, like it was, this is my whole life. You don't joke about, you don't make a joke about. It's gotten more. So I remember there was this one Family Guy episode where they were making fun of. They were like a freshman orientation, so they were making fun of like this wokeness diversity. So this is early 2000, like before it became really crazy. And there was like this guy who's like this bureaucrat, and he's doing the freshman orientation. He's like, women. He's like, look to the man to the left of you, the man to the right of you. Statistics say both of them will rape you. And then one guy goes, I won't rape you. And the other one goes, I might. Right.
Oh, I
and
remember that.
This was Family Guy. This was early Family Guy. Like, I don't think they would do this anymore. This was early 2000s. You're right. So it did change, like between 2005 and 2020. Like you couldn't even like Family Guy, something edgy. You couldn't do that. I do think it's like feminism, and then it's like Me Too. It's like this stuff is just so bad. Like it's so like
so prohibited. It's extra taboo. Well, so that was like the most shocking, because like generally, like, oh, this is like how bad can high schoolers in the 1950s really be? And I thought about like Greece, like okay, so they're gonna be like speeding and drinking and smoking, but like how bad? But then like that scene was like, oh yeah, okay, so these like they're trying very hard to show these kids as monsters, and like that scene where they assault the teacher. That was like pretty bad. Like,
well, they basically try to jump like I mean it's shocking. They try to jump.
Well, they beat up Dadier like later.
They keep trying to beat up their teacher. Like they keep trying to kill him.
They jump him in an alleyway. Yeah, that was pretty. Yeah, that was funny too. Actually, like, yeah, yeah. And then yeah, at the end they pull a knife on him. So yeah, like these, it was like, it was really interesting to see, like, is this what was this like people's first exposure to like what inner city life was like? Like, most Americans, they probably don't know, and so they see this movie and they're like, oh, this is really bad. One thing that I thought was interesting was like the perspective of this movie, where if a similar movie were to be made today, like, there have been kind of similar, like Coach Carter, like that wasn't that recent, but like when I was in high school, I remember that movie came out and was really popular. Did you see this? The Samuel L. Jackson, based on a true story, he plays like a basketball coach in the inner city, and these kids who are troubled and messed up and whatever, and he like sort of helps them to whatever, like he's a mentor to them. But like it focuses on any kind of movie like this now, it like has to focus on how bad the kids' lives are, and like that's why they're so awful now. Whereas this movie, Blackboard Jungle, it's like it takes the perspective of the authority figures and the teachers, right? Like we're just here trying to do our jobs and teach these kids, and these kids are just like animals. They're just like totally uncontrollable. And yeah, he has these. You see Dadier, the main teacher, like interacting with the other teachers and like the whatever the principal and stuff. And they're just like, you got to get through. You just got to teach these kids. Like they're unteachable. They're monsters. Um, yeah, it was really like to have like a movie take the side of the teacher rather than the student. Like that was really interesting to see.
So
I don't think
yeah,
they would do that anymore.
so for people who haven't seen the movie, we could just give like a short, just like
Yeah,
plot summary, because there's not all that much. It's like this is like a genre by now, where like a teacher goes in, like they often show the teachers, but teacher goes into like a tough, like high school. I think they're high school kids. Um, yeah, and so he's a World War II veteran. His name is Dadier. He's Dadier. They call him Daddy-O, which they think is really funny. Richard Dadier is the guy's name. And basically, it's like there's shenanigans, and he's trying to reach. It's like Stand and Deliver, like Dangerous Minds, like
do I
this
reach
is
these kids?
yeah, maybe this is like the first of that. I don't know if this was like this might have been like the original from that genre. I don't know. Like there might have been something before it, but it looks like it could have head off this entire genre. And that's basically like the entire plot. Oh, and his wife is pregnant, and they're he's like someone is sending his wife letters. There's the second telling him like your husband is fooling around.
Oh yeah, yeah. Was that the students? Was that the students?
Yeah,
Sorry,
yeah.
I
It
guess I
turned
was
out
supposed
to,
to believe.
yeah. Spoiler. There's all the spoilers here, but yeah, it turned out to be that bad kid, right? Artie West,
Oh
the
right.
the mean blonde one. Oh, yeah,
Yeah.
but you're right about like showing like why they're screwed up. Like often they will go in the modern movies, they'll show their family situation. So they'll say, oh, they've got a mom who doesn't care, or they've got a broken home, or whatever. And in this, you don't even know that these kids have families. Like you don't see any. There's no role in like their families, and this made sense because their like family breakdown wasn't like as big of a problem back then, right?
Even
So like
even for like poor, like blue collar, whatever, low income, right? Like all of
yeah,
those kids, almost
probably
all of them had a mom and a dad at home, right?
yeah,
That's just how
maybe. I
things
mean, maybe
were.
maybe this was the worst of the worst. Maybe 5% didn't have, and maybe these were the bottom. Maybe this was supposed to be the toughest 5% of the population or whatever. Um,
But that was like it was literally like 5% out of wedlock birth rate at that point in the 1950s. So like it's possible, but like even then, most of those kids, like yeah, yeah. So
no,
yeah,
no,
that's
but if it
interesting,
was
right?
like the worst school in New York City, in the inner city, it could have been much higher than 5%, right? It could have been way.
Maybe, yeah. I mean, okay. I guess like theoretically it's possible, but yeah, like if they went to most, yeah, that would have been interesting. They go to their, yeah. I wonder if that didn't even occur to like the filmmakers. Like it just wasn't like
Yeah, to show a
because they
broken
probably
home,
did. Yeah,
right?
because the broken home, the concept of the broken home didn't even like really exist yet. And so like that couldn't have worked as like they didn't even try to explain these kids because
Yeah,
like
yeah.
there
There was
was
no right. There wasn't like they
no
were spoiled. It
environmental
wasn't like they
cause.
had it too good. Yeah, there was no environment, or like it's genetic, but I guess. But like, why are they bad
But
now in
movies
the
don't show that, right?
1950s?
Movies have
Yeah,
to have an environmental cause, like that just looks better on a screen to show that. And so, yeah, like that's I found that like that interesting too. I mean, and yeah, Dadier, he has a wife. I looked up the actor and the actress. Like, I think so. He was like almost. I think he was in his late 40s when he played that role, and the actress was like 25 or something. So she was like literally half his age. And I found this. I think this was because people today, like a lot of feminists and a lot of like critics and stuff, they complain today. They look at like Tom Cruise and then the love interest, and they're like, oh, Tom Cruise is so much older than the love interest. This has been going on in Hollywood for much longer, and I think it used to be worse because. So I just saw at the cinema nearby where I live, they were showing Vertigo, this old Alfred Hitchcock movie from 1958. And even then, like, I don't remember the guy's name, but the main actor, it was essentially like twice as old as like the two women who were interested in him. And it's like, I think like that was just like, now I think there's a little bit of the gap has shrank somewhat. But I think like back when movies used to be made, like it was just accepted that like, oh yeah,
Yeah,
the
I
male
mean,
lead's going to be 40 or 50 and the woman's going to be 22. Like that's just
yes.
normal.
I mean, because it makes sense. I mean, it makes sense. This is what people's preferences, right? The male preference goes down for women, as they age, and not so much for men. I mean, this is just these people are sort of mad at
But what
nature.
I find interesting is that like it's never like commented, because I think in the real world that's not how marriages looked in 1950. I think like there's always been an age
Yeah,
gap, but not 25 years, not twice as old as the
but
wife.
but they're not. But they
But
don't
it's
have to necessarily.
never pointed
Yeah,
out.
but in the show, they're not. They don't in the movie. They're not necessarily the same age they are in real. Like maybe Dadier was supposed to be 35 and she was supposed to be 30. Like okay, so it's like maybe but they just had a 40 man who's actually
That's
40 and a woman
possible,
who's
but like
25.
the reason I even looked it up, because like to me the visible age gap is so apparent that I'm like, this guy's
Yeah,
pretty old. This guy's getting up there, and she looks very young. So I looked
yeah.
it up. I'm like, okay, but maybe like suspension of disbelief, maybe. Um, yeah, yeah, and then well, yeah. So yeah, the whole, and then I think he was supposed to be like a war veteran, which I guess makes sense for the time, right? 1955. And he's trying to like talk to these other teachers. Also, the other thing is like I think most of the teachers, or at least half of them, were male, and I was curious about that too. Like has
Not half of
like
them. All of
yeah,
them except one, I think.
that's what I remember
Except that
too. There
one
was
woman
one
who
female teacher.
they try to rape. Yeah.
Yeah, the one. And so that is unique too, right? Where like today the vast majority of teachers are male, or female rather. Like was that actually like, did that reflect reality in the 1950s? Were like most teachers for high school or inner cities or whatever, like has that ever been the case where the
I
majority of
I
men were teachers? That was shocking to me.
I assumed that they were. I didn't think about it. Um, well, okay. Look, here's a Quora says in the U.S. teachers have been predominantly female since the 1880s. Well, that's interesting.
I
Okay, I
know,
didn't know
like,
that.
yeah, teachers have been like a female dominated profession. And so I just wondered, like, why
Huh.
did the movie choose to show like the staff or the faculty of this high school as like majority male? Um,
Yeah, it could
yeah,
have been. It could have. Well, it could have been like maybe elementary and high school were different. I mean, maybe high school was seen as more of a professional job, where elementary school was just sort of local. And 1950s like school, local like elementary schools, they didn't have federal involvement yet. It was a very sort of, I think, very very local sort of, probably not very well paying kind of job. While the high school, I think, might have been more, like higher paying and maybe attracted more men. I don't know. I don't know. Um, yeah. Maybe it was the gender segment. Maybe they all assumed like high school boys would try to rape any woman they saw, and like maybe in high school was because they did it that way. Because they treat the woman like, oh, wait till they see. It's not like they treat like it's normal for. And I think this was, there's this one funny line where he's like, I'm going to go to a girls' school. The other guy's like, think about the 20-year jail sentence. You couldn't make that joke
oh
today
yeah,
because it was like
yeah, I remember that.
you wouldn't even like the younger girl, right? That's like you'd be a pedophile or something today. But no,
Yeah,
they make that
the
joke.
thought is not allowed to occur to you, right?
Yeah,
Like
and
that
so like
wouldn't even occur.
I think for when they get into like teenage years, I think there was maybe more of a trend towards segregation by sex. Like they didn't put older men with women and they didn't put women with young men just because of all the problems. That seems to me like possibly what was
This
going
was
on.
an all male school,
Yeah, yeah, that's right.
right?
That's right. Yeah,
So maybe that's why. I mean,
yeah.
yeah, that was interesting to me too. Is like you can almost like, yeah, it also maybe for disciplinary reasons, because like, yeah, if you're a woman trying to teach an all male inner city school, like the likelihood of any of them listening to you is like almost zero. Whereas like, yeah, if you have like a lot of male teachers present, like the possibility of like them actually
It's
taking you
interesting.
seriously is probably a
Before
little
you
bit
said that
higher.
it's an all male school. Yeah, I hadn't even thought of it, but yeah, it is an all male school. There was no females, and
Yeah.
I never even crossed my mind.
Yeah, that stood out to me. And like, yeah. So there were a lot of interesting things about this. And like, yeah, I have no idea how accurate of a reflection of reality this is. But yeah, like all the male teachers, like a male school, yeah, like the surprising like brutality of the students. And like, yeah, I guess like now I can see like why this had that sort of cultural footprint. And then yeah, I mean it's funny, like today we hear that song and it sounds like very almost wholesome. right? Like it's an oldies rock song, and it's like, if you heard like teenagers listening to that today, you'd think like, oh, what a nice group of kids. But I think my understanding was from those excerpts you sent me, and then like I read a bit about the history of that song. Is like this was like a song that it was like to celebrate mischief, right? Like college students would play this and like whatever, like they like would dance to it at parties and drink to it, and it was like an entry, like rock and roll as a genre was like an entryway into like because I think like we just accepted as a culture that being a teenager you're supposed to be rebellious and do drugs and have sex and do all these crazy things. And I think like before this movie and before rock and roll, like I don't think teenage like the concept of being a teenager and being a troublemaker, like those two things like didn't really exist in like the cultural imagination. It was sort of memed into existence, and now we just take it for granted, which I find that like that part is interesting too. And it started with such a like an innocent sounding wholesome song.
Well, to our ears, if you
Guitars.
listen to the Yellow Rose of Texas, it was like the number. It was like number one or number close to number one of the Billboard chart. It's like Yellow Rose of Texas, I love her. It's like this was what was topping like the charts before this era, right? It was like the stuff that was from like it sounded like the 1800s, so the culture was sort of stagnant, and you can imagine like Rock Around the Clock to like somebody who's just listening to like Civil War ballads, right? Would seem
Yeah.
pretty shocking. Yeah, so this is from Thompson's book, The Unis. He says the reaction to Blackboard Jungle was something like hysteria, not just among teenagers, but also among their parents and politicians. Kids danced in the aisles of movie theaters and blasted the songs from their cars. On May 17, 1955, the Philadelphia Inquirer reported that Princeton University dorms held a competition to play the song as loudly as possible from their rooms. As around midnight, the students emptied into the quad, set fire to trash cans, and chanted up and down the streets. Meanwhile, several major American cities censored the film. The mayor of Memphis forbade teenagers to see it, while Atlanta tried to ban the movie after an alderman's wife complained that it threatened the peace, health, and morals and good order of this city. That's the funny thing about like Memphis. What a terrible city Memphis is. Sitting in fear of the. There's it's Steven Pinker's The Better Angels of Our Nature when he's trying to explain like the increase in crime in the night. His argument is that crime, violence has decreased over the long period of time, but he acknowledges the rise since the 1960s. Um, and he goes, he's like, what are the theories? He's like, dismisses the economic stuff and other like that. And he's like, those people in the 1950s who were squares who warned us about rock and roll was going to like destroy the world. It turns out they were right. Like there was this cultural change that just sort of shifted everything. And so you look at like Memphis, and like Memphis was probably like a safe city in the 1950s, as was probably Atlanta. And the people who worried about this stuff were completely right. I mean, this did sort of break down the culture, and it just like people I think don't acknowledge that.
Yeah. I mean, it's sort of a like broadly, like from a kind of social scientific perspective, it's interesting. Like the whole debate, I'm thinking about like the debate with like video games and music and television and like and music. Like, does any of this actually have an effect on behavior? And, like at least like the video game research, supposedly the conclusion is like it has no effect, or if there is an effect, it's like reverse causation, where it's actually violent kids are more likely to play violent video games or whatever. But then like I read things like this, and then I see like in reality, especially music, man, like it has such a strong effect on young people and their behavior and like their willingness to behave in a certain way, or like there's a reason why they play certain kinds of songs at like nightclubs, right? Like if they started playing jazz or Mozart or like classical music at like your standard nightclub, like people would not like people behave very differently, right? And so yeah, like there is something about rock and roll that I think like had a sort of underrated effect on American society and on like youth culture. And yeah, like it sort of like was it like sort of inaugurated like what would happen during like the sexual revolution in the 1960s.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't think it was. I don't think it's that underrated. I mean, I think it's like acknowledged as sort of a historical watershed, although people wouldn't want to connect to crime and this other stuff. Yeah, I mean, the video game stuff. Like, I remember when I was a kid, Mortal Kombat was a big deal. Do you remember? Are you old enough to remember this? Where Mortal Kombat, there was like one of them. It was either Sega Genesis would let you see blood, like you hit someone and the blood would come out, but Nintendo was more wholesome. So like if you bought it for Super Nintendo, they wouldn't show blood. I think like green stuff would come out if you hit them or something. And so this was a little thing. Eventually, the Mortal Kombat games became more explicit. Everyone allowed blood, and it became maybe still not Nintendo. Nintendo might have stayed wholesome. It wasn't a. Yeah, man. I hope I'm remembering this correctly. But yeah, I mean, at that point, but like that wasn't gonna be like seeing one more game. that's like Mortal Kombat with like blood is probably going to make a difference. But like going from like the 1950s to the 1960s, I think opening that floodgate, like for the, like just putting it in people's minds that like this is an option,
That's what I
unquestionably,
mean. Like, I
the
don't mean
change.
like it was underrated in terms of like, its acknowledgement in terms of like, whatever, like its popularity or something. But I mean in terms of like actually changing behavior, right? Like if rock and roll had never existed, like I think like behavior would have been measurably different, in terms of right, probably sexual behavior, drug use, probably like crime too, as you pointed out. And yeah,
Yeah.
it started with this movie and with that
Well,
song.
yeah. I mean, the question is, would that have happened anyway? Because this is one of the things that Thompson's the chapter in the book sort of speculates on. Like, if it wasn't for Blackboard Jungle and Rocker on the Clock, like, would it have happened anyway? It sort of suggests the history suggests maybe not, or would have been something else. Like maybe it would have been like early hip hop or something, like an early version of hip hop or something would have maybe came along that made people a little bit crazy just because whatever, like religion was declining, communications technology was opening up. There were like, people where the culture was going to change. I don't think the culture was going to likely to just stay the same. There was just too much going on in the world. But what form it would have taken, like, who knows? Who knows? Like the song, it's literally possible. This song, like, determined the entire course of America, like after the 1950s. I mean, it's like an amazing thought. But I can see the argument for it. I don't think it's ridiculous.
I mean, I'm thinking about like I remember when I when I rewatched Mad Men a couple of years ago. One thing that recurred throughout, like I think 3 or 4 different times, a character in Mad Men said, like if they're trying to like justify something, like Roger would say, like, well, like the song says, enjoy yourself, and then he would whatever have another drink. And I think like this was an interesting sort of like illustration of how like at this point, right, like music had sort of become pervasive, and like the lyrics, people would remember them. Like you'd have these jingles, you'd have these songs, and like people would just sort of defer to that as like an authority to like justify something they wanted to do and then act on it. And so I mean, yeah, maybe it's not doesn't necessarily like change behavior, like get you to do something you wouldn't do. But if you want to do something and then the song is playing, or it's has some lyrics that you find captivating, or it makes you feel in a certain way, then you'll act on that thing that you wanted to do anyway, and maybe you would have ordinarily inhibited yourself, but you because of the
Yeah.
music you didn't.
Yeah, I mean, when I was a kid, when we grew up at the same, around the same time, it was like, yeah, hip hop. Like kids who were like, like just got together and drank or smoked weed. They would listen. We had 3 6 Mafia, like local in Chicago, and we just like we'd listen to this stuff, and it's like, yeah, kill, get them hoes, smoke a blunt. Like especially like yeah, we'd smoke blunts and listen to like Nelly, tell us, pass around the blunt and how cool it is and how that's the greatest thing in the world. Yeah, maybe
Yeah,
we would have
yeah.
smoked pot anyway, but like the fact that this was like this art form telling us that like this is what is cool. It's not just you're a loser wasting your life. Yeah, I think that like that unquestionably influenced people. It's not like it's not like crazy that like culture affects children. I mean, I think it's just insane that we pretend the opposite.
Yeah, I mean, I remember getting into this discussion with this other student at Cambridge a few years ago, and so we were discussing like taboo research in the social sciences, and she was basically saying like, okay, so like I accept that this research is real, but if this information were to get out there, like this might increase whatever discrimination or prejudice or something. So I'm not entirely sure. Like it's yeah it's true, yeah it reflects reality, but I don't know if people should be whatever, completely exposed to all of this. Let's sort of keep it between us intellectuals or something like that. And then like later, she and I had this conversation about music, and she was telling me how much she loved hip hop and all this kind of music and stuff. And then I kind of made the same argument to her where I basically took the opposite stance where I was like, yeah, like I enjoy this music too. I like the music, but I don't know if it's like the greatest thing in the world for this to be playing everywhere, especially for like young people who have no guidance and blah, blah. And she was like, well, the artists are just sort of, they're reflecting reality through their artwork, right? Like they're describing their upbringing and what's cool and what's popular and what's exciting. And these are just sort of, they're just artists trying to paint a picture of reality. And so it was interesting, like this sort of asymmetry here, where for me, I was saying like, okay, so we have the science and it's true, so we should tell people. And she was saying, okay, so we have this art and it's, it reflects reality to some extent. And therefore it should be widely known and widely popular and widely exposed. And we just have like sort of differing views about like, for her, if the science is known, this could be bad for society. And for me, it's like, if the music is popular, that could be bad for society. And
Yeah.
so yeah, I think there's this like
Your argument
there's
sounds
almost like
much
a
better that like people are influenced by rap rather than social science, you know? I mean, it's
well,
pretty
I think
ridiculous.
that's yeah, I think that's right. I think that's probably true. But I just find it interesting that like people have these differing intuitions about like which parts of like quote unquote reality, whether depicted through art or sort of discovered through science, whether it should be widely known or widely distributed or something. I'm like, yeah, I think that's probably right. Like rap is just so much more compelling. Music in general, right, is more interesting. And yeah, like I remember doing all the same things you're talking about with yeah, doing drugs or hanging out or just whatever, getting into trouble and like playing the music, like the music in the background. It was just like part of life, and it was part of like, it felt like whatever, like these artists, the musicians, like they were what like emboldening you somehow.
Yeah. Yeah, I think, I'm not, yeah, I don't know how you feel, but I'm not like completely like negative on like the changes of like the 1960s. Like, I don't think I would have liked to be in a 1950s, America. I think, I sort of like the idea of there's more, freedom. You can go out, you could meet people, you could sort of experiment with different things. So yeah, I think it's complicated. I think you acknowledge the costs, you acknowledge the
Yeah.
broken homes, the
Well,
crimes, the disorder, and then
yeah.
just like, but like freedom in like the very broad like liberal sense does appeal to people too. And are people happier or unhappier in the end? I'd say probably happier. I mean, I'm sort of a liberal in that way, but I could see the argument on the other side.
Well, when I think about like okay, so like the 1950s, and like yeah, watching these kinds of movies, movies from that era, like I think like yeah, I think it's appealing to me, right? Like yeah, having that kind of freedom and the music and like whatever, like the sort of widespread availability of the automobile and all these kinds of things, like yeah, that appeals to me. And then yeah, when I look further back than that, like if you look like the 1930s or like yeah, like what you were describing earlier about like how all the music was sort of stuck in like the 19th century, where you had these Civil War ballads or like these whatever patriotic songs or something, like that just sounds awful to me. That like especially before the car, right, where you're stuck in your little town in your own little community, you can't meet people, you can't so I think if you're, especially if you have like a certain kind of personality type, if you're high on openness and you're just a smart curious person, like that would be brutal to like not be able to meet other smart like-minded people. So yeah, there is like yeah, there are trade-offs, and I'm not, yeah, I think like at a certain point I think we went a little too far, but yeah, I think before the 1950s definitely not. And so yeah, I think like yeah, there are trade-offs, and it's but then on the other, like it's like generally I think liberalism is good for people like you and me, but then for most people, right, like it's probably hasn't been that great. So
I
there's sort
don't
of
I don't know about most
costs
people. It's hard.
and
It's hard.
drawbacks.
It's hard to say. It's hard to
Yeah.
say. Like people at the very bottom, yeah, but like just like the average, housewife in like 1950s, like she probably didn't like. She probably wanted a little more freedom. Maybe, I don't know. Maybe not. Maybe they
Well, I
exceeded
think
that,
like
right?
well probably elite housewives didn't like it, but I think like probably like middle class or below. Um, yeah, I'm not entirely sure how how
Yeah.
bad things were.
So
Um,
yeah, yeah. One thing I want to talk. So the one thing that I found so interesting was So there's two main student characters. There's this guy named Arnie who's just like bad. He's nothing supposed to Artie, and he's just bad. He like tries to like attack the teacher. He's the one who, spoiler alert, is sending letters to his wife telling Dadier's wife, telling him that her husband's cheating, and he almost has a miscarriage, right? The wife almost has a miscarriage from all this stress, right? I think the
oh
baby
yeah,
the
yeah,
baby
yeah,
survives.
yeah,
The
yeah.
baby survives though, and the but there's this other student who's like a heart has sort of a heart of gold, is like a leader, but is like is also a bad kid, but also has like a good side. And Sidney Poitier. He's black, obviously. His name is Greg Miller. And I was so surprised. Like the one thing that I was surprised of the 1950s culture was how contemporary sort of the racial issues were. Well, first of all, it was like yeah, it was sort of contemporary, but also like in a way, it was like almost like pretending society was like more progressive than we pretend today. So like this is an almost all white school. There's a handful of blacks, right? There's this one Hispanic kid. I think it's supposed to be Puerto Rican. But
But yeah, yeah, okay.
okay, yeah, but this guy, Greg Miller, is like a sort of leader, and the primarily white student body, like they all look up to him as like their leader. Now, if you have like a like lower class whites kids today, I don't think they necessarily look to the black guy as their leader. I think lower class whites, it's a very politically incorrect thing to say. Maybe even our conservative listeners will not like this, but yes, there is racism among young lower class white men, right, or white boys. But here they are in the 1950s, and there's like no racial issue. He's just their leader, not officially like their leader, but just like a guy who's sort of like the alpha male in the class. And it's interesting that they would portray, like, I don't think this was reality. Like in the 1950s, I don't think this would have been the reality of like how kids would have responded to like a black student in class. They probably would have, fought with him like anyone else. I don't think they all would have like lynched him on the first day or anything, but I think there would have been racial tensions.
There were no racial tensions really, were there? Like, I didn't really see any like any kind of
nothing.
Ethnic conflict.
They make fun of him, like they make fun of the Mexican, or the Hispanic kid. They like make fun of his English skills or something, and he's like, "Hey, cut that out!" Right? But it's not a serious problem.
Yeah, that was and then the Sydney, what is his name is Gregory in the movie. And they accepted him as like the default, and no one pointed it out. Like Dadier, he didn't say like, "Wow, they're letting you be their leader." Like, this is kind of
remarkable.
And then there was there was also that other interesting scene. Who was it? Was it Artie? Someone reported Dadier to, was it the school principal, for racial remarks? Oh, because he said the N-word in class as like an illustration of like why you shouldn't use these slurs, right? Like, it's like this very, like you said, like a very contemporary in terms like topic, because like this stuff still happens, right? Where like if you use the word even in a certain specific context where you clearly do not endorse its venomous intent or something, you could still get reported. And so somebody reports Dadier for using this word in like a pedagogical, because he also uses like he says like mick and spick and all these other words too, but like, so they're reporting him for racial prejudice. And the principal actually like gives him a sort of he sort of condemns him and talks to him and says, you can't do this. And then Dadier defends himself. And in this sense, like, I thought that was realistic, where he was like, no, I was, he explained what the case was, and then the principal just accepted it and was like, okay, that makes sense, whatever. But yeah, the fact that like that was even a punishable offense, or was like serious enough for him to be issued any kind of potential penalty, was shocking to me. Because at least like the potted history of the 1950s that we get now is like everyone is a racist. It was just acceptable to say whatever you wanted. And I don't know how accurate the movie was, again, like compared to reality, but that was like very interesting, that you couldn't just be, racist as a teacher back then.
Yeah. So it was interesting because Dadier is like, well, first of all, they accept this is something different from today. Like, they accept his explanation that it was in context. So like, today it wouldn't matter what the context was, but the fact that they accept it is something different. But, the fact that he's so like, I have racial prejudice. I don't have a racial prejudice. Like, the fact that like, a guy in the 1950s is told he was racist, I would have thought like he would have been like, so what? Like, so maybe I don't like that Mexican student. Like, I don't think he would have been like that shocked. Like, it was the worst thing, you could accuse him of. It's so the moral lesson that like nobody should be prejudiced, and like we have to overcome prejudice. It was there in the 1950s. I've seen some things. I sort of had seen hits of like this. Wasn't this like this sort of picture of the 1950s we've always getting, where everyone was just unapologetically racist? Wasn't like with reality. I saw like Iglesias or one of these smart liberals on Twitter post like a Superman comic or something from the 1940s and 50s, like lecturing kids against racism. Like, a bunch of kids want to beat up another kid for being a different race or something, and he's like, no, we're all Americans, Johnny. And it's like, so they had this sort of like what you'd call proto woke propaganda. Like, it was apparently part of like the culture of the 40s and the 1950s. It of course doesn't take off and become prominent until the 1960s. But yeah, I mean, it feels so contemporary, right? It's like this idea of like he's just the leader and race doesn't matter. That's like sort of a 1980s, 1990s thing. Like, that would be even hard to that would be hard to do today. But the idea that like racism is bad and we should all not be racist and we should all, treat each other as individuals, it feels very, very contemporary. I was surprised by that. The gender stuff feels completely out of date because like the wife, the younger wife goes, "Do you think I'm pretty?" Like she's just wondering, "Do you think I'm pretty?" Like she's very like the way the males and females interact with one another. One point the female teacher, like one of them makes a joke, like, "Oh, you're going to be the teacher. They better have the National Guard ready." And she's like, "Oh, you like she's like
Oh,
very
yeah.
she's like very flattered by this compliment." So it's just this gender stuff just completely changed, while the race stuff just seems like, yeah, it seems like Groundhog Day. It seems like 1950s. A lot of stuff was the lessons were the same as today.
Yeah, that isn't. Yeah, a lot of those scenes could have taken place. Yeah, in like 1999, right? Like that scene could have easily taken place of like the teacher being called in for racial prejudice and then explaining himself and being exonerated, but being offended that somebody even call him racist in the first place was just outrageous. And so, yeah, I'm wondering, like, okay, so if you went to an actual teacher in 1955, would they really care about being called racist, or was this like, was this like a sort of proto woke, like trying to sort of meme anti-racism into being by like depicting a society and promoting color blindness or something like that? Like how much was it like a reflection of reality versus sort of an aspirational, on the part of the filmmakers and the writers of like, wouldn't it be nice if race didn't matter, so let's make this movie in this way? I don't really know, because on the one hand it's supposed to be like shocking, right? It's supposed to be this movie about like inner city hoodlums and the violence and the chaos and the disorder. And so in a weird way, I almost think like, why would you sugarcoat the racism part of it? Like, okay, so
Yeah,
they're violent, they're rapists,
yeah,
they, knife wielding thugs, they beat up
right,
their teachers. Why would they also be racist?
yeah,
Like, is it like, is racism, was that like the ultimate taboo even in the 1950s,
yeah,
where you could be like all these bad things but you couldn't be
yeah.
racist?
Yeah, now you can't be a rapist and you can't be a racist. Today, you can't be a rapist. Right, but you could be a racist. Yeah, you could be a racist. Yeah, that is an interesting way of putting it. Like I think that we talked about Oppenheimer and I'm reading the biography. And so it was like this is a very elite circles for Oppenheimer, right? But there was a book called Realignment about like sort of the New Deal coalition and like economic liberalism and like social liberalism and liberalism on race were pretty well correlated even by the time of the Roosevelt, right? That was already sort of baked in. So it was like maybe it was just something that yeah, elite Americans, did. It's so interesting. I mean, because like interracial marriage, like even in the 1990s, you don't see interracial couples a lot, very often in shows. Like it's just like whenever we were kids, like they had classified ads in the paper or like yeah, whatever dating ads, and they would be like it was completely normal to write single white male looking or single white female looking for single white male. Nobody thought that was strange. It was like I just assumed that like people could like form families like within their own racial group, and that was like into the 1990s. Now like I don't know if like okay Cupid they still even like allow this racial stuff. There's probably at least you don't talk about it. It's controversial to say I prefer only to date white people or something like that. Um, but yeah, it's but like yeah the idea that like otherwise besides like dating and marriage I suppose right and Pontier like stars in a movie Guess Who's Coming Home to Dinner right which actually addresses this directly so that's like the next step in this evolution but besides that like yeah Gregory is exactly like everyone else there's sort of a pull yourself up by the bootstraps because there's one part where he's like I'll be a mechanic because people don't care what color you are as long as the car gets fixed and he's like, that's all I could do as a black man or something like that. And then like that, he's like, that's no excuse. He's like, and then he mentions like some like a successful black people. He's like, Ralph Bunche. And like I forget the other names. I didn't recognize the other names. You know who Ralph Bunche was? He was I think he was so when I was at UCLA, like the gym was I think named after him. I think he was like a tennis player who became like a UN ambassador or something like that. So yeah, it's Bunche Hall was which had the political science department at UCLA. Um, and so yeah, I just remember the Ralph Bunche, and he mentioned some other black guys who'd succeeded in American society. And so yeah, there's like this like don't make racism an excuse which is contemporary. It's not 2020, but it's like 1985 or 1995 or
Yeah, well, I
something
think even
like
all the
that.
way up to like 2000, all the way up to like 2010, I think that
Yeah,
would have been like
yeah,
unremarkable in a movie to like say like, yeah, racism exists, but you still have to work hard. But then, yeah, after the Great Awakening, that became forbidden. But yeah, like that, yeah, I think like the whole like the racial dynamics in general, right? Like it's like lower class, Irish, Italian. I guess like the Hispanic kid, he's probably Puerto Rican. I think there might have been two Hispanic kids, and then the one black kid. I don't know if there were any other like black kids in the class,
I think there
but
was.
yeah,
I
it was
remember at least one other black kid.
there was one other,
Yeah.
and then yeah, like but none of the teachers, right? They were all like they were all like sort of middle aged white guys, and then like the one female teacher who might have been a little bit younger than them. Um, yeah, it was just a very like interesting mix there. Whereas like now I don't know like how many like inner city schools now. I'm imagining like it's probably the reverse, right? Where it's like mostly black and Hispanic, maybe like maybe like one or two like token white kids. But then yeah, like it's very different, right? Like you went to school like near Chicago, right? Like didn't it was your school like that, like kind of a
No, my school,
mix
it
or
was very, it was right on the border of Chicago, but like the racial patterns were completely tied to the geography. So like in my suburb, it was like everyone was white. One block over was Chicago, and you'd get the black school. So I had one or two black students in like my high school, but like if you go to the store, it'd be like 50% black because they were in close proximity. So yeah, the Chicago's like one of the most segregated in the country, but a lot of these cities are segregated because people move based on
well, I think
the school district.
Blackboard Jungle seemed at least like so it seemed accurate enough because I read Thomas Sowell's memoir pretty recently, and he described the schools in Harlem, and then like yeah later he went to Stuyvesant, but like yeah he went to different schools around New York City, and my impression was like yeah it was something like Blackboard Jungle where it was like because the names like Thomas Sowell would say, oh, I made friends with this kid and it was an Italian name, or like I knew this kid, it was an Irish name, but then there were black kids too. So I think it was like, and he was describing the late 1940s when all of this was happening in his life. So I think like, yeah, like, or mid late 1940s. So I think at that point, at least in New York City, which I think is where Blackboard Jungle takes place, right? Is this in New York? That he's a new teacher at North Manual Trades High School, an inner city high school of diverse ethnic backgrounds. But does it have it doesn't describe the city that it's in. Anyway, so yeah, I think that's that kind of ethnic breakdown makes sense though in that school. But I don't know the city it takes place in, or if it's supposed to be ambiguous.
Like so, the cities were overwhelmingly white for well beyond the 1950s. A lot of cities were. What was New York City's demographic in 1950? What would you guess? What percentage white?
Well, so today New York City is like 30% roughly.
Yeah.
In 1950, probably 70, I'd say.
Yeah, I would guess 70 or 80, something like
No,
that.
probably 80. I would say closer to 80, right? Like before the Hart-Celler Act, before like mass immigration, like yeah, it was probably like
Yeah.
most, especially in the poor areas, right? It was like Polish, Irish, Italian, like I mean, if you
Yeah, New
if you
York
count
City.
Italians as white, which some people don't.
Yeah. Let's see here. To era. Yeah, it was over 90% non-Hispanic white until the post-World War II era. Hispanics, Asians began selling in Manhattan in the 1920s and after World War II. So yeah, I mean, probably around 90 until it says until the post-World War II era. So yeah, by 1955, probably 90 or 80 at lowest. Yeah. So yeah, this looks right. Um, yeah, I think that's the demographics at least are correct. Now, does Thomas Sowell talk about like violent scenes like in the way like this
Yeah,
movie
he
like the
does
TV
actually.
shows?
Like nothing on the level of Blackboard Jungle. Like he doesn't talk about like knife wielding or like trying to rape a teacher, but he does talk about like yeah, he talks about getting into a fist. Actually, yeah, he talks about fist fighting one of his teachers.
Does he? That's
He
funny.
himself like he describes the scene. He's in a classroom. I don't know how old he is. He's probably maybe middle school. And yeah, like a teacher like whacked him over the head, and then like Soul gets up and starts swinging punches at him, and then like they get into this altercation, and the teacher like threatens
Wait,
some kind of
the teacher
disciplinary.
the teacher smacks him first.
Yeah, the teacher like smacks him upside the
I
head,
love that.
and
I
then
love that
Soul's
40s
immediately on
America.
his feet and starts swinging, and then he threatens disciplinary action, and Soul like he's like he writes I knew that teachers weren't allowed to like physically hit their students, so I called his bluff and said go ahead, like go ahead and do whatever you need to do, I'm just gonna whatever report you, and then the teacher ended up backing down. But yeah, so and then he talks a lot about like just fights breaking out in the schools, and like he kind of like glosses over like, he just says like, yeah, we get into trouble, we get into mischief, but he doesn't give too many specifics other than the occasional fight breaking out in the middle of a class. So in some ways, yeah, I guess I can believe that this is, maybe Blackboard Jungle is like, perhaps an accurate or like an exaggerated or embellished version of reality in some of these schools.
That's interesting. So I want to read his biography now. I read his economic stuff. I really do want to read his biography. Sounds like he had a lot
His
of
book
great
is good.
experiences.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it seems like just like the common theme here is like, I mean, today, like, they shoot each other. It seems like it seems like the theme here is like everyone sort of maybe had more testosterone, because you see these things about like testosterone declining or sperm
Yeah.
quality. Yeah, it's
Both sperm count and
Yeah.
T levels are supposedly
Yeah,
dropping.
yeah. And so like teachers, like, you dare the teacher, he smacks you. Like the teachers today don't do that. Like the kid hits back. They see a pretty girl, they want to go after her. Like, it seems like that's all just related to uh, being higher testosterone, and maybe that's like the difference between that. And now we have, I don't know, we have more violent crime. I wonder how much of it is just like guns. Like if I don't know if people started shooting each other. I think in the late 1960s. So like I think that guns became more available. I'm not 100% sure about this, but they might have become more available in the 1960s. And that could.
Well, I have seen research that like the percentage of 12th graders who've been in a fist fight has declined considerably, like over the last few decades. So like, yeah, physical violence, like especially like everything else, right? Like all the data that like Gene Twenge and Jonathan Haidt, they always share this, like after whatever smartphones, everything started declining. But like fist fights are like, that's just another example of this pattern that like it was relatively stable, actually. I mean, it was like a slow decline since whatever the mid 20th century, whenever they started collecting these data. But then, yeah, after the smartphone, like fist fights dropped a lot, because like, yeah, I remember like fights breaking out in my schools too, like on a pretty regular basis. And like, it's funny to think about it now that like kids were getting into fist fights at like 8 o'clock in the morning. Like now I think about the idea of like fighting someone at 8 a.m. Like it just seems like so like, but like, you're so hopped up on energy and like, I don't know, whatever. I think like smartphones, yeah, I think like T levels were probably dropping even before the smartphone, but I think like that had some kind of like an effect too, of just like people just engaging in less physical activity in general.
But just like casual violence. Yeah, so another thing Pinker has in his book is like he has ads from the 1950s, and what is like telling you to work out or something, I don't know, selling you a workout plan or something. It's just like, you'll beat it. Like the payoff is you'll beat up this guy who like talks to your girl, or you'll beat up this guy who tries to mess with you, right? Like you don't see that anymore. You don't see it like just maybe in the 1980s, like the bully movies, like where you'd be bullied and then you beat them up. Like you still had this, I think, up until the 1980s, really. I think 1990s, I think you get a real feminization. I think you get a real sort of like the start of therapy culture, where they start giving boys drugs. We start talking about our emotions. You have the Sopranos in the late 1990s, sort of just it's like sort of like demonstrating this culture. I think you see the rise of sort of big psychiatry and sort of like this feminization between it's gradual, like between the 50s and the 80s, but then I think the 80s and the 90s. I think that was like a really big difference, and that it's been going more in that direction ever since. Maybe with the war on terror, maybe there was sort of like a little bit of a uptick in like masculinity, I think, in like after 9/11 and George W. Bush.
Yeah, because if you look at like all the anti-hero dramas in the movies, right? Like, okay, yeah, Tony Soprano goes to therapy, but like there's still a ton of violence in The Sopranos, and yeah, The Shield and all. Yeah, a lot of those shows, like it was a really interesting it was sort of a conservative turn in a lot of the media and the pop culture in the 2000s. So I think like, yeah, they may have been like a sort of mini revival of some of this stuff. And like, yeah, at least like, it may have been like a function of the town that I grew up in too, and like the people I was around. But like, yeah, I remember like, WWF was popular, like monster trucks were popular, like just generally like sort of mayhem and violence and destruction was still like cool and interesting. And yeah, over the last few years, it's like
that stuff is still. Although WWF, we call it WWE now. Like half the wrestling is now women's wrestling. So like in the 1990s, women's wrestling was like bra and panties matches. Did you watch it? They would have like spanking matches.
Yeah.
And now,
those.
like
I felt weird. I was like 11 watching them. I'm like, should I be enjoying this?
But now like they have women wrestlers, and they just treat I don't watch it, but as far as like what I see on commercials, they seem to be just treated like the male wrestlers. I'm surprised that this has like a market for this for like young boys? Do young boys just want to see like girls fight in the way that like men fight and have rivalries? I don't know. But whatever, they've gone in that direction. And so yeah, and they, they have them like they give the women wrestlers like like high billing, like they'll show them in the commercials. It's the same with the NBA. They'll have like commercials, like they'll put the NBA with the W, and that WNBA is not profitable. The WNBA, till to this day, does not have, does not make money. And so why are they doing this? It might be the same with the wrestling. It just might be like it's politically correct ideology. People in the companies, feel like you could have like fold the WNBA. You could have just say the WNBA is unpopular. Doesn't make any money. We're gonna stop having it. People would go crazy. So
Well,
yeah, I think
is it
like
like
they're
it's sort of a tax they pay for like social cred, right? Like they pay this tax to be seen as like fashionable and politically correct and sort of, doing their part to like shape the culture in a more progressive direction. So like they're willing to like exchange economic capital for cultural capital.
Yeah. I think when they started it, it probably was like thought it might be a profitable at some point, but I think like now, like you can't come to the conclusion that
You can't,
you
yeah,
kind of lose.
right. You can't dismantle it now.
Yeah, yeah. So, did you enjoy watching this film?
Yeah. I mean, oh, yeah. So one more thing on the sort of whatever the attitudes around sex and gender. There was a scene where so Dadier's wife, she's pregnant, half his age, and at one point he says something to her about like when the kid is born, and he says with your looks and my brains, this kid's gonna be a winner. I was like, they couldn't have that today, like the man telling his pregnant wife, with your looks and my brains, like
Yeah,
and then like it's consistent with her earlier quote that you mentioned about like am I pretty? Do you think I'm pretty? Like
yeah. Like she cares about
like
the. Yeah, she's
just
like,
those, like
it's okay for her to. Yeah, you couldn't do an opposite. You couldn't say with the man's looks and her brain. She has to be superior in looks and brains. Like you can't insult her looks either.
yeah. You can't insult anything. Everything. Yeah, it's like that sort of whatever. Well, like, isn't there some kind of a name for this syndrome of like the like more recent like female characters, like protagonists in movies where they don't struggle, right? They're already perfect, and this is part of why they're actually like less interesting, is because like historic, whatever, like the female superheroes apparently like they're already perfect throughout the movie, and like there's no struggle. But anyway, so this movie, this is yeah, I mean, I enjoyed it. Like it was, I always expect these kind of like older movies to be a bit slower and like the pacing's a little different. And yeah, but I no, I watched it. I'm glad I watched it. Like I stayed with it, and generally I enjoy watching these kind of older movies. Like just for like the stories in themselves are always interesting because they're always simpler, right? Like you don't have to have plot twists and ulterior motives and like four different subplots going on. Like movies used to be very simple and straightforward. There's sort of like like an A plot and a B plot, almost like a sitcom, and like maybe one or two supporting characters, and then it's just like very easy to follow, which is part of why they're kind of slow. But as like a glimpse into a different part of American history, it was like, it was good. It was good. Yeah.
Oh, by the way, did you notice that like the poster for the film, like, is basically the scene where the woman gets attacked in the library?
Oh, on the Wikipedia.
Yeah. So it's like, yeah, so she's looking at the map. She's like, ah, like, she's like screaming and she's about to
Most
get
startling
raped. Well,
picture in
another
years.
thing that was really modern about the race thing, it just reminds me that like the black guy can't be pure evil. Like the blonde kid, the kid who's pure evil is Artie. He tries to make his wife
Blonde
have a
kid.
miscarriage. He tries to get the guy fired. He's just bad. There's nothing good or redeeming about this guy at all. While Gregory is like a dignified black man who like mouths off or whatever, but is actually like a good guy and isn't gonna like kill his teacher, or
He
rape
saves him
anybody
in
or
the
anything.
end,
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
He ends up being his ally in the end.
Yeah.
Uh,
So that's also pretty modern. Like the black guy, like if there's a monster, it has to be the white guy, and like the black guy has to be like more complex. He can't be just like pure evil.
that is so interesting, that asymmetry there, where the attitudes on sex are like very like 1950s, right? Whereas the attitudes on race are, they're very contemporary, where like a lot of it could be, like 2009, basically. Like that is sort of where it is. Yeah, like in a way, like yeah, we sort of reverted back in some ways with the like post Great Awakening, but yeah, it's like, huh. Yeah, well, like yeah, a lot of those things. Yeah, still the thing that shocked me the most was like when Dottie gets called in the principal. You were making racist. Like this happened in the 1950s. Like this, but yeah, that's a good point too. That like the whitest blondest
Yeah.
kid is the the most evil kid.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was
Yeah.
yeah, that's right.
Yeah, the Hispanic one is pretty harmless. Just makes jokes and stuff. Yeah, yeah. I'm glad we watch this because I feel like we've been propagandized a lot about like the past, and just watching like the cultural products of the time, I think just gives you a different perspective. So I wouldn't have I mean, the race is. I think that's the lesson. Race is like nothing has changed. I mean, a lot has obviously changed, but like it's recognizable. It's not a different planet. It's like we get like what they're doing on black and white issues. And on sex, it's like looking at a different culture. I mean, it's like from 1800 or something. I mean, it really is. We've progressed quite a long way on that. So yeah, I mean, like yeah, like and so of course, like homosexuality, or whatever. It's not even portrayed. It'd be interesting to see like what the earliest portrayals of like homosexuality are in films, and like how is that? It's like different. But I want to do more of this. I want to watch more like 1940s and 1950s movies because I think it's just a fascinating time capsule.
Yeah. I agree. Yeah, I'm up for it to watch more of these. Yeah, this like yeah, I never would have watched like this movie was not on my radar at all. Like I don't think I've heard of the song. Like the song is like this is one of those things where the song becomes more popular than the movie. But yeah, I would have never watched this otherwise. But yeah, when you said like this is the movie that launched the popularity of the song, like that intrigued me. I'm like, huh, interesting. Like I didn't realize it was tied into a film. And then yeah, like yeah, it was very interesting. Yeah, good movie.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. And we'll probably do then more old movies then. Until next time, Rob.